Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Ria, this is Ellen Evan Co, and in 2025 I'll be teaching you to create and curate your dream wardrobe. So to anyone who's subscribed to the channel since my last video, the everything I made in 2024, thank you so much. I got a lot of comments and subscriptions from that video, so I really do appreciate all the support. So just wanted to say a big thank you for that. Today's video is all about your first sewing project. So if you're new to sewing and you want to spend 2025 learning, this is going to be the video for you. Now, I've seen a lot of blogs and vlogs and content saying that your first sewing project should be something relatively simple like a tote bag or a pillow slip or a pair of boxer shorts, which is totally valid. But listen, okay, here at Ellen Evan Co, I want you to train how you're going to play, right? And my mama always taught me that if you're going to be sewing garments, you need to practice your sewing by making garments. So in this video, I'm actually going to be sewing for you guys, or with you guys, I suppose, the exact dress that my mum taught me how to sew. Like, it was my first ever sewing project when I was like 13 or 14. And I'm 27 now. So yeah, let that sink in. This is the pattern here. She's beat up. She's old. Like I said, I'm 27 now. I made this for the first time when I was like 13 or 14. So she's about, like 13 or 14 years old. Holy heck. But the reason this pattern looks this way is because she has been loved. I have used her lots and lots of times. She is very versatile. So let me just, give me 1 second. Here she is. I should probably like put her in some different packaging or something, but she is the Quick Sew K3521 pattern, and she's done me good. I don't know if she's technically a women's pattern or like a young adult's pattern, but the sizing is really generous, so I don't think it's an issue. There's a lot of ease in this pattern. So like I said, I learned to sew with this pattern. My mum chose it for me, and the reason she chose it for me is because it has a lot of simple techniques, but techniques that you're going to be using all the time when you're sewing. She's got darts, she's got gathers, she's got facings, lining, she's even got an invisible zip, which, don't be afraid, I'm going to teach you guys how to do an invisible zip. It is the key, I think, in taking, your sewing to potentially looking like it's homemade to handmade. Well, actually, there's a lot of different things that will help make your clothing look like it's store-bought, but I think so many people avoid putting in an invisible zip in their first few projects, but if you learn how to do it properly, and there are a lot of different tips and tricks to get it done, you'll be fine. It's not as intimidating as it might seem. So not only is this just a great opportunity to learn the techniques that are involved in dressmaking, but it's also just a really good way to get your reps in. What I also appreciate about this pattern for beginners is that it has a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, or 1.5 centimeters for any like people from the UK or my fellow Aussies watching this video. Now, I'm going to put in a PSA here. Sewing is the only place where it is acceptable to use both the metric system and the empirical system. I don't know why, but I do measure things both in inches and in centimeters. There's no rhyme or reason. I feel like anything under like 12 inches, I will measure in inches, and anything over that, I measure in centimeters. I don't know. It's just when you're sewing, you can use both. A lot of patterns that we get here in Australia will have measurements both in inches and centimeters, but often, especially with these paper patterns, the seam allowance will always be listed in like either 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 5/8 of an inch. Drop a comment below if you're a seamstress or a sewer and you use centimeters and inches when you're working with your sewing projects. I want to know I'm not the only one. But yeah, this pattern uses a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is quite large. So what that basically means is that there is just a little bit more of a margin for error, which is always really nice when you're starting out. So if you need to let it out or take it in, you've got the extra fabric there in the seam allowance to be able to do that. The other thing that I just love about this pattern and that makes it so great is that she's a classic. She's got so many features that we're seeing in style at the moment, like the boat neck, and you could even like drop her waistline to sort of make her really on trend. She can be short, she can be midi length, you could even make her maxi length if you wanted to. And this pattern's like over 10 years old, right? So it just goes to show that if you invest in sort of a timeless pattern, you'll be able to use it over and over again. Choosing silhouettes like this that are a little bit more classic and timeless are really, they're going to pay dividends in your wardrobe at the end of the day. Now, keeping with the timeless and classic theme, I am going to be making this dress in black linen. You know, having a little black dress, it's always a staple in your wardrobe. If you watch the Everything I Made in 2024 video, you'll see the sort of slinky black backless number that I made. And so that's like the only black dress I have in my wardrobe right now. Now, the first thing we have to do before we do anything else is prep our fabric. So preparing your fabric is key to, you know, making sure you don't have further issues with your garment down the line. So first thing you want to do is wash your fabric, because your fabric will shrink in the wash. There's usually added dyes, a little bit of extra starch, and it just gives the opportunities for that to run out and then for your fibers to shrink down. If you wait to have the first wash after you've already cut out and made your clothes, you're going to run into a couple of issues. Number one, the clothes will shrink and not fit you. Number two, the fabric at the seams will often start to buckle because the fabric fibers will shrink down, but the thread fibers stay the same length. So you get this weird distortion at the seams, which is it's not cute, trust me. Take my advice and take it now. Always wash your fabric before you cut into it. And I know it can be like so exciting. You go to the fabric store, you bring it home, you just want to dive right in. No, don't do that. Because it, you know, if you watch my previous video, the cream short set with the waistcoat and the shorts that I made in linen, so many of the issues that I eventually had with that set could have been avoided if I just pre-washed my fabric. So learn from my mistakes, please. I've already pre-washed the linen that I bought for this, as well as the cotton that I bought for the lining. I did that as soon as I bought it. So that's kind of what I'm starting to do now. I buy a fabric, I bring it home from the fabric store. The first thing I do is just chuck it in the wash. You just chuck it in on a cold or like a cool wash with like a bit of, you know, what do they call it? I was going to say dishwashing detergent, not dishwashing detergent. Just like laundry powder or laundry liquid, whichever you use. Just like a mild cold wash. Yeah, I make sure that I do that before I even end up touching the fabric, because otherwise, yeah, issues do arise. Now, after you've pre-washed your fabric and you've let it dry, the next thing you're going to do is iron it and try to iron it on grain. I'll show you what that looks like coming up. I still need to iron this fabric, so I'll take you on the road with me for that. But yeah, always wash your fabric, people. Okay, so it's time to iron. Here I am ironing my fabric at my dining room table. I do this because my ironing board is really tiny and I like being able to see. Now, you'll notice I've got the fabric folded, and I'm also trying to match up the two selvage sides as perfectly as I can. So the selvage is the bit at either side of the fabric. It's usually a lot thicker and a lot bolder. This runs parallel to the straight grain line of the fabric. So I like to use this as my North Star for getting my pieces on grain. You don't want to be trying to match up the rough cut edges because they won't be on grain and your pieces are going to drape really poorly. You can literally see here next to the selvage, there's the straight grain line and then the cross grain line as well. Now, for this pattern, I have 2 meters of linen for the shell and 1 meter of cotton for the lining. The fabric recommendations are in the pattern, so it would just depend on the width that you're trying to buy, because a lot of the time when you're sewing, you'll be using 2 mirrored pieces or you'll have pieces cut on the fold. Ironing like this with the fabric folded just makes it a little bit easier when it comes time to cut it out. I've just finished ironing my fabric. It's hanging over my office chair so it doesn't get any wrinkles or any extra creases in it. Now, the next thing to do when you sort of get into your sewing is to determine what size you are. The measurements are on the back, but they'll also be on the pamphlet inside. Time I checked and took my measurements, I'm like 86, 67, 99, 97? I can't actually remember my hip measurement, so I'll take it again. What a lot of patterns will have on their actual pattern pieces and not on the measurements, which is kind of annoying, but it's always good to check for this, is the measurement of finished garment at the fullest part of the bust or fullest part of the hip. And some really great patterns will have your measurements in size, but then the finished garment size, because obviously, unless it's like a bodycon dress, it is going to be slightly bigger than your body. Does that make sense? With this one, I know that I'm a small because my bust size is 86 centimeters, and the small on this pattern says 86 to 90 because there is a fair bit of movement, like a bit of ease. But it says on the garment, the measurement when it's finished in size small is 94 centimeters. So it's a bit of an oversized fit. I want it to kind of have a bit more of like a relaxed feel. Okay, so it is day 2 of making this dress. Yes, I look different. I'm a bit more casual today. I predict that this dress will probably take me about, anywhere from like 5 days to a week to make. Bear in mind, I have 2 rugrats. It might not take you that long if you don't have kids, but that's all good. It's all part of the process. Now, we sort of left off yesterday deciding what size. Based on my measurements, we're going with size small for me, but take your measurements. I'll make a video on how to do that, but I'll link one in the meantime down below. Remember, going off of your measurements in inches or centimeters is going to be so much better than just choosing what you think is your normal dress size. Always go by the measurement. So now, the next thing we have to do is cut this bad boy out. So first things first, we're actually going to cut out our pattern pieces. So I've got my self-healing mat and some copy paper that I've taped up. We're going to flip it over so we can actually draw on it without worrying about the tape. Now I've got all of the sizes of my bodice pattern here all cut out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out my piece on the paper. Usually I'd iron my paper pattern pieces, but this pattern is quite old and I don't want to damage it. So I'm using my paperweights, aka my crystals, to make sure it's as flat as possible and that there's no creases or anything like that that's going to be distorting the pattern. I'm then going to go in with my little cowboy boot-esque tracing wheel and my ruler and basically press down over my size with the tracing wheel, just using the ruler as a guide. So what this does is it puts little divots on the paper that I can then go and trace over. Now, if you don't have a tracing wheel or a self-healing mat, you can always use like baking paper or tissue paper, or even go and buy pattern transfer paper that you put over the pattern pieces and then you trace out your size. And look at that, when we lift it up, I can go in with my pencil and my ruler and watch as the magic happens, guys. You see your pattern come to life on the page. You do want to make sure you're going in and marking any landmarks like your grain line, cutting on fold, any notches, and making sure your darts are in there as well. And then you can go in and cut it out with paper scissors. Do not use your fabric scissors on paper. Make sure you use proper paper scissors for this one. And there it is, your pattern piece. Woohoo! Here is the part I think everyone gets the most nervous for, and that is cutting out your fabric. Now, I've got my pattern pieces here for my front bodice and back bodice. We're going to start with the front bodice. Now, it is cut on the fold, so we can actually flip it the other way to sort of save space. There's the grain line. It runs parallel to the center fold, so we don't have to worry about matching up the grain for this one because we know it's going to be directly on grain when it's on the fold. And then we just go in and we pin it all onto the fabric. I really like using quilting pins. They're longer for one. They've got a bigger head, which makes it easier to use, and they're a lot sharper because they're made to go through multiple layers of fabric, so they're not going to snag your fabric, which is always a plus. It's time for the back piece, which has a curved center back to follow the curve of your spine, but this means we have to go ahead and match up the grain. Now, the best way to do this is to take your measuring tape and measure your grain line parallel to the selvage edge there. So I'm adjusting it a little bit to make sure. I believe at this measurement it was like 7.5 inches. Obviously it's going to be different on your piece of fabric, but I like to cut the back piece as close to the selvage as possible to be able to do this. So I'm making sure that all the way down that grain line is the same distance from the edge of the selvage. So I'm pinning at the top. I like to do this to sort of use as a pivot point. So as you'll see, I'll stretch out the pattern piece, making sure it's smooth, making sure it's sitting flush, and I'm measuring up, make sure it is the same distance all the way along that grain line. I'm definitely going to make another video solely dedicated to weave and grain and going into it in a little bit more detail, because it's really, really one of those fundamental important things when it comes to sewing. But just knowing that it's something you have to do, even if you don't understand it, it's gonna be helpful, right? And it does take a little bit of time. You can see me going back and fixing it up, but here I am making sure it's all on grain, pinning it all, and then getting ready to cut it out. Now, as you can see, I have my fabric scissors. We do not use fabric scissors on paper, and we do not use paper scissors on fabric. And I am just going in and cutting it out. Now, this piece of fabric is obviously the perfect width for this pattern, as you can see. But when I'm cutting out my fabric, I do try to think about piecing and cutting it out in a way that is going to have the largest pieces of scraps and save the most material, because, you know, we're trying to be sustainable. We can use the larger scraps for something at a later date. You should now have your bodice pieces and your skirt pieces cut out in both your shell and your lining fabric. The next step from here is to mark your darts. So I'm going to show you guys how I do this. Like I said, you needed to transfer your darts onto your paper pattern, and we're just going to use this as a guide for transferring this onto the fabric. So I like to go in and mark the center of the dart, like right smack bang in the middle there, as you can see, because we're going to measure that in a minute. I also then mark the base of the dart and transfer that to the fabric. And then I'm going to measure up on my fabric the length of the dart. So these darts here are 6 inches, which is, you know, a nice even number. I'm going to measure that, and then from the center of the dart, we're going to mark 6 inches at the tip of the dart. So I'm just going to go in and measure the length of those little triangles and mark it all onto the fabric with tailor's chalk. And there you go. Your dart's on your fabric. And we're basically just going to go ahead and do that with all of the other 3 darts. Now, just to be sure that I got the dart placement perfect, I did measure the distance between the tip of the 2 darts there, and it was exactly 2 inches on this side of the fabric. And then when I went and checked on the actual pattern, it was 2 inches as well. But then when I checked this side of the fabric, it was just falling short. So I knew that that dart near the bust was actually coming in at the wrong angle. So I've gone in and measured, moved it to where it needed to be. You can see me trying to rub out the previous dart. And then I am going back and making sure that that is still 6 inches and putting the triangle in there. So it's just one of those things, right? You always just want to double check, triple check, go by eye, and make sure all of those landmarks are transferred properly. And measure it again. It's 2 inches. We know they're their exact same now. Happy days. From here, the next thing to do is start pinning the darts. So I like to put a pin at the top of each dart right there at like the point of the triangle. You can see me doing that here. I then go in and put pins at the base of each triangle. So what we're essentially trying to do is fold these darts or these triangles in half. So I start at the point or the tip of the dart, and I take that pin out, and I basically just pin it in there at the top while it's folded in half. And as you can see, my pin goes through the fabric and lines up with the chalk on the other side. That's basically what I'm going to do all the way down that folded dart. So I put my pin in, line it up with the chalk. As you can see, it's slightly off, so I just shift it a little bit, pin it again. When I flip it over, you'll see that the pin goes straight through the chalk on both sides. That's how you know it's perfectly folded in half. And then I do it again closer to the bottom. It does take a bit of time. It's a little bit finicky. You will get better at it the longer you go. And then you've got this folded in half triangle, this dart. I'm going to show you guys one more time. So I take the tip of the dart, the point, I pull that pin out, I put it through the point, slightly folded in half. The pin goes all the way through to the other side. It's perfectly aligned. I then do the same at the bottom. The reason I put the 2 pins down the bottom is sometimes it's easier to be able to feel the pin on the other side matching up with your pin. I shove the pin through, I lay it flat. When we turn it around, it's all the way through perfectly on the other side. And I'm going to do it one last time. Like I said, you can see my finger sort of rolling the fabric, and then it's there. Look at that. Perfect. It looks amazing. And then when we lay it flat, this is what you get. You get these darts that are shaping around the bust. It's amazing, right? I'm going to do it on the other two, and you'll see what I mean. Also, quick tip, you'll see that all of my pins are pointing down towards the base of the garment, and all of my pin heads are towards the top. That's so when I put it under the machine, they're easier to pull out. You'll see it's starting to take its shape. It's looking like a top, like a finished garment, and it's just the coolest thing when this happens. We're going to do the same on the back pieces, both the shell and the lining. They'll all be pinned up and ready to go. Just remember that your back pieces are mirrored pieces, so make sure when you put them down they lay like this, otherwise you're going to run into issues. Now you'll have your front bodice in both your shell and your lining fabric, and then your back bodice in your shell and your lining fabric, and then you'll also cut out your skirt. Okay, so that is the end of part 1 for learning to sew your first ever dress. The irony is not lost on me that we haven't even touched the sewing machine yet, but we will in part 2. So guys, make sure you like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next video. Bye guys.